This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Tarkir Dragonstorm, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Tarkir Dragonstorm set review. I've already looked at all the multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black cards, and in this video I'll give you my thoughts on all the red ones. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited. That means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are some things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Second, these are, of course, also my evaluations of these cards before it's possible to play this new format, since the goal is for me to have my set review done for you in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some things. But as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I update you with my thoughts on the format. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are a couple of set review related perks for becoming a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the red cards in Tarkir Dragonstorm. First up, we've got Breaching Dragonstorm, which for 4 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast it without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 8 or less. If you don't, put that card into your hand. When a dragon you control enters, return this enchantment to its owner's hand. I like the other Dragonstorm enchantments a reasonable amount, but I don't really like this one. Most of the time, you're going to spend 5 to cast a much cheaper spell, and that's just not good. It does mean you are going to trigger Flurry when you cast it. That's a mechanic that pays you off for casting 2 spells in a turn. And the fact you can cast it more than once makes it interesting. It sort of becomes a mana sink of sorts that you'll replay when you don't have anything else to do with your mana, and it will give you a card. It's just that in terms of mana, you're not really going to feel great about it. There's no guarantee it actually impacts the board the turn you play it either, so I think it's a D+. Next up, it's Channeled Dragonfire, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery that deals 2 damage to any target, and it has Harmonized for 5 generic and 2 red. This is the first time we're seeing this mechanic in this video, so I will read the reminder text. You may cast this card from your graveyard for its Harmonized cost. You may tap a creature you control to reduce that cost by X, where X is its power, then exile this spell. This is great. Sorcery Speed Shock is already a card that lets you kill a whole bunch of stuff on the cheap, and you can even finish off your opponent with it. Throw in Harmonize, and this becomes a 2-for-1, or sometimes in the late game you can cast it and Harmonize it in the same turn to take down an X4. Sure, the Harmonize cost is really high, but it is upside on a card that you already feel great about playing. This is premium removal, it can generate 2-for-1s, and it can even kill bigger stuff when it has to, or finish the opponent off. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Corey's Steel Cutter, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has Trample and Haste. It has Flurry, which means when you cast your second spell each turn, something good happens. In this case, you make a 1/1 white monk creature token with Prowess, and you can attach this equipment to it, and it has equipped for 1 generic and a red. So, without Flurry, this is kind of a passable equipment. It does enough to make most creatures into a bigger threat, though putting this on like a 1/1 isn't exactly going to move the needle. However, once you throw Flurry in, this looks great, especially because this is a kind of Flurry trigger you really only need to trigger once to feel like you're getting a good deal, since the equipment itself is so cheap and it even equips to the new token for free. I wouldn't count on this turning into Monastery Mentor and spitting out a bunch of tokens, but it doesn't really need to be a really good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Devoted Duelist, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Goblin Monk at common. It has Haste and Flurry. This creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. This looks super underwhelming. I was just talking about how Flurry triggers, where you can only get them once and feel good about it, are probably pretty good, but this is one that you're not going to feel good about unless you trigger it a ton, and you can't count on that. Meanwhile, the baseline is a 2-mana 2/1 with Haste, and that's not a card I really want to run to begin with. Sure, it's fine on 2 sometimes, but it's going to run into X3s if you weren't on the play, and it dies to tokens and incidental ping. It's a 2-drop, and you usually need them, so that saves it from really being like an F, but it's probably a D, the kind of 2-drop you run when you're desperate. Next up, it's Draco Genesis, which for 6 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment. You may cast dragon spells without paying their mana costs. Omniscience is an awful limited card, and this is like a super restrictive Omniscience. Problem is, you just don't have a stockpile of cards in your hand by the time you spend this much mana, and you're already going to be able to play every single card you draw. This is an F. Next up, it's Equilibrium Adept, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/4 dog monk at uncommon. When it enters, you exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and it has Flurry. This creature gains double strike until end of turn. I'm already happy to play a 4-mana 2/4 that effectively draws me a card, and that's what this type of effect essentially ends up being. When you're given a window until the end of your next turn, you just end up being able to cash in that card way more often than you don't. And that means this is typically a 2-for-1, and it's also nice that it can even set up Flurry for itself because you're going to have an additional card available on your next turn. So it having double strike once is pretty doable, and you know, this is a trigger where just triggering it once isn't that exciting, but the baseline of the card is a 4-mana 2/4 that draws you a card is so high, it's fine that the trigger here isn't the scariest thing possible, but I mean, it is real. Your opponent does have to worry that you might be able to trigger it if you played like a creature in your first main phase and you have mana up and stuff in your hand, because you might have an instant. So, you know, this looks like a really good uncommon to me overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Fire Rim form, which for 1 generic and a red is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. When it enters, enchanted creature gains first strike until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0. So this is like a worse Sure Strike the turn you play it, and that's not exactly a trick that's amazing. As with Sure Strike, this does nothing against removal, but is pretty good in combat. And of course, the +2/+0 in this case will stick around on subsequent turns. That's not the most exciting buff ever, but it does mean if you can take down a creature with this, and then you have this left behind, it feels pretty good. Still, it's situational and easy to blow out, and a little too narrow to really even be a trick you always want to play in your aggro decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Fleeting Effigy, which for 1 red mana is a 2/2 elemental at uncommon. It's got haste. At the beginning of your end step, return this creature to its owner's hand, and you can pay 2 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. I don't really like this. Having to recast it every turn is not what you want to be doing, and the buff is too expensive for you to really count on being able to do something meaningful with it, whether your opponent blocks it or not. Now, the upside here is that it can help you trigger Flurry multiple times since you can cast it every turn, and that definitely matters, but this would be like an F or close to it if it didn't have that upside, and I think it's probably still just a D. It's only good in the exact right deck, and even in that deck, it's a very narrow card. Next up, it's Iridescent Tiger, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/4 cat at uncommon. When it enters, if you cast it, you add 1 mana of each color. So if you can cast something else with the mana the Tiger generates, you'll be in business, especially if you use all 5 mana to play a second 5-drop. That's a turn that shifts the game in your favor in a big way. Problem is, you just don't always have something else to spend the mana on. It does help that this format has mechanics like Harmonize and Renew, both of which give you something to do with your mana even when you don't have something else in your hand, but even then, you're not going to feel great about things. It does get better the more cards like that you have, and mana sinks in general go nicely with it, but the baseline is very mediocre as a 5-mana 3/4, and sometimes that's all it'll be. This is a card that can set up Flurry provided you have another card in your hand or a spell in your graveyard to cast, but still, I think it's a C overall. Next up, it's Jeskai Devotee, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Orc Monk at common. It's got Flurry, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and you can pay 1 generic and add blue, red, or white to your mana pool, activate only once each turn. So this whole cycle is like at least solid Cs. They fix your mana reasonably well, and they have passable baselines. This one can even turn into a 3/3 or at least threaten to, which will make your opponent think about whether or not they want to block it. And it being a 2-drop that fixes your mana is pretty nice, giving it a C. Next up, it's Magmatic Hellkite, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/5 dragon at rare. It's got flying. When it enters, destroy target non-basic land and opponent controls. Its controller searches their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped with a stun counter on it, then shuffles. This is a cool design for like land destruction these days. They don't really like to design cards that just straight up destroy land and don't let your opponent grab a land. And this does that. It lets your opponent get a land, but the fact that you stun it does still give you the ability to deny your opponent some mana, which is cool. That said, that's mostly going to be relevant in 60 card formats. In Limited, it's mostly a 4 mana 4/5 flyer. There are dual lands at common and tri-lands at uncommon and a cycle of powerful rare lands, so you're going to hit something with it, maybe once a draft or something, and it's going to feel pretty good when you do. But mostly it's a 4 mana 4/5 flyer, but that's a great stat line, so I think it's a B. Next up, it's Meticulous Artisan, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 Djinn Artificer at common with prowess, and when it enters, you make a treasure. So a Hill Giant stat line is a pretty ugly thing, but this comes with a couple of nice abilities. The fact it generates a treasure sort of pays you back a mana, and we've seen 4 mana 3/3 make a treasure before, and it's always okay. Fixes your mana, maybe gives you something expendable to sacrifice, ramps your mana, and then it also has prowess, which means even though it starts as a Hill Giant, it can relatively easily be a 4/4 when you need it to be. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Molten Exhale, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. You may cast this spell as though it had flash if you behold a dragon as an additional cost to cast it. And to behold a dragon, you choose a dragon you control or reveal a dragon from your hand, and it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Even if this never, ever had flash, it would be really good, since it's 2 mana for 4 damage. That's really going to let you trade up most of the time, and it will have flash reasonably often, really opening the door for massive blowouts. This is quite easily premium removal and probably just the best red common because of its efficiency, giving it a B. Next up, it's Narset's Rebuke, which for 4 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature, and you add blue, red, and white, and if that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. 5 mana for 5 damage is normally a D+ or C- level removal spell. Like the kind of removal you run when you don't have better options. The problem is that when you spend this much mana, you reduce the chances that you're killing something that's actually worth killing for this much mana. The Rebuke adds some additional upside though, and that matters. The exile part is relevant against death triggers and the renew mechanic, and if you can cast something else or use an ability with the 3 mana it gives you, you're going to feel really good about things. However, it will just be a 5 mana spell that does 5 a significant chunk of the time, so I think it's probably a C at best. Next up, it's Overwhelming Surge, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. Choose one or both. Overwhelming Surge deals 3 damage to target creature, destroy target non-creature artifact. So 3 damage for 3 mana at instant speed is fine, although unexciting. You can trade up sometimes, but it doesn't really feel premium most of the time. The additional mode is nice, but it's not going to come up a ton. This format isn't crawling with non-creature artifacts, so you're not going to generate this 2-for-1 very often. The times you do actually get to destroy 2 things with this are obviously going to feel incredible, but they'll be few and far between. Mostly this is just 3 mana to do 3 at instant speed, and I think that makes it just a C+. Next up, it's Rescue Leopard, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/2 cat at common. When it becomes tapped, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So, dying to 1 mana removal is brutal on a 3-drop, but this does hit reasonably hard and is likely to rummage from time to time. Having high power matters in this set too, and this is good if you harmonize, not only because it has high power, but because you'll tap it and get to draw a card. Still, it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Reverberating Summons, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. At the beginning of each combat, if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn, this enchantment becomes a 3/3 monk creature with haste, in addition to its other types until end of turn. You can pay 1 generic and a red, discard your hand, and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. This does not look very good to me. It's a 2 mana do-nothing enchantment that needs you to double spell before it actually contributes to the board, and even then it only does so temporarily. That's not enough to make this worth playing. Having the discard option does matter, and it's what you'll do when you're out of gas. I mean, it can effectively draw you 2 cards in the late game, and that helps save this card from being like an F, but it's still so brutal early that I'm not really feeling it. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Sarkhan Dragon Ascendant, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary human druid at rare. When it enters, you can behold a dragon, and if you do, you create a treasure token. Whenever a dragon you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on Sarkhan. Until end of turn, Sarkhan becomes a dragon in addition to its other types and gains flying. So if you can behold a dragon with Sarkhan, it's going to feel awesome. A 2 mana 2/2 that makes a treasure when it enters is an incredible card in terms of efficiency, and I think you're going to be able to do that a decent chunk of the time. Most decks are going to have like 3 dragons in them. This set has a lot of dragons. In most formats, you would have 0 dragons, but in this one, like I said, I think you'll probably have like 3-ish dragons in your deck, and the chances you have one of those in your opening hand when you play this on 2 are reasonably high. And obviously Beholding also works if there's a dragon already in play, and it's nice he's got an additional dragon payoff, one that gives him a permanent buff. So, you know, he's not generally going to take over games, but he's super efficient and can stay relevant for much of the game thanks to the dragon payoff, so I think he's a B+. Next up, it's Seize Opportunity, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. Choose one, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards, or up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+1 until end of turn. So this is either a red divination of sorts or a combat trick, and I kind of like those being the 2 options. The combat trick mode is more situational, but when it's good, it's real good. Like when you save a creature and do more damage, or better yet, it gives you a 2-for-1 by saving 2 creatures and killing the opposing creatures. Meanwhile, if the game is in a state where that mode isn't useful, which is reasonably often, well, you just get to draw some cards, which is likely to help you in a big way on a board state where the combat trick mode isn't that good. I'm kind of tempted to give it a C+ because I like the design, and these impulsive draw effects have been so good, but at 3 mana, it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Shock Brigade, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 Goblin Soldier at common. It's got Menace and Mobilize 1. That means when it attacks, you create a tapped and attacking 1/1 Red Warrior creature token and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This will usually be able to get in when you play it on turn 2, and if you can get in with that token as well, it's going to feel pretty good. And there are lots of things you can do with these tokens in the format, so this looks like a solid 2-drop, giving it a C. Next up, it's Shocking Sharpshooter, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 human archer at uncommon. It's got reach. Whenever another creature you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. And this ability is no joke in a format with 2 token generating mechanics. Like, Mobilize will do tons of damage to your opponent when this is around, in addition to the fact that just like playing creatures is going to do some serious pinging. This will feel like it delivers more than 2 mana worth of value pretty often, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Stadium Headliner, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior at rare with Mobilize 1, and you can pay 1 generic and a red and sacrifice it, and it deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature. Playing this on 1 will feel pretty good, as it'll often let you do 2 on the next turn. Now, if it was just a 1 mana 1/1 with Mobilize 1, it wouldn't be that good, just because it would quickly end up in a situation where there weren't good attacks to make. But it comes with an ability that turns it into a reasonable removal spell, so it's likely to matter late too. And obviously you can attack to get an extra token to better enable the ability in the first place. I think that makes this a B- overall. Next up, it's Stormscale Scion, which for 4 generic and 2 red mana is a 4/4 dragon at mythic rare with flying. Other dragons you control get +1/+1, and it has Storm, which means when you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. Copies become tokens. So there are dragons in this set for sure, but most red decks still aren't going to have like more than 3, so this 6 mana 4/4 flyer will not always be buffing something, so it's kind of clunky. The ideal thing to do with this is play at least 1 spell before you cast it, because once you are paying 6 mana to get 2 5/5s, we're talking about an amazing deal. Keep in mind, Storm counts your opponent's spells too, so if you go to combat and your opponent kills something with a removal spell, if you cast this in the second main phase, you're still getting 2 of them. Still, to consistently get 2 dragons here, you probably need a healthy number of 1-drops, and while I think Jeskai decks especially are already going to be geared in that direction, you're going to end up just getting a 6 mana 4/4 flyer a little bit too often for this to be anything amazing. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Storm Shriek Feral, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/3 dragon at common. It's got flying and haste, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. And it has an Omen, which means that you can also cast this as a spell. In this case, one called Flush Out, which is a sorcery that costs 1 generic and a red, and you discard a card, and if you do, you draw 2 cards. And if you cast the Omen side, you shuffle this card into its owner's library. So the Omen side is Tormenting Voice, a passable, albeit unexciting card, though it is one that works nicely with things like Prowess and Flurry. The creature side's in a similar boat. It's passable, but unexciting. It's very understated for the cost, though it makes up for that a little bit by being able to hit your opponent the turn it comes down. It's kind of like 2 C- level cards together, which I think is enough for a C. Next up, it's Summit Intimidator, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Yeti at common. It's got reach, and when it enters, target creature can't block this turn. This is an interesting card because it's a callback to Summit Prowler, a vanilla 4 mana 4/3 that was surprisingly solid in the original Khans of Tarkir. But that tells you a lot about how creature power level has changed at the lower rarities, especially because they added reach and an enters trigger here, and it's probably about as good as Summit Prowler was in original Tarkir. The Inter's trigger can be pretty good here, but it can also be irrelevant. You know, I don't love it when triggers are all in on something like this one is, because there are going to be times where you're behind and it doesn't matter. But there will also be times where it really opens the floodgate on your opponent, but the body's not anything special. It's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Sunset Strike Master, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 human monk at uncommon. It taps for red mana, and you can pay 2 generic and a red, tap it, and sacrifice it to do 6 damage to target creature with flying. I'm already in on this card without the second ability, and I'm probably already in on the card with just the second ability. So having both is pretty nice. It's a 2-drop that ramps your mana really effectively, something that there are incentives to do, especially in Temur, and obviously can also help you double spell to trigger Flurry and stuff like that. So the fact that later in the game, when maybe you don't need the mana as much, it basically turns into destroy target dragon is definitely relevant, especially in this set, obviously. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Tursa Light Shatter, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 legendary orc wizard at rare. It's got haste. When it enters, you discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. And whenever it attacks, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, exile a card at random from your graveyard. You may play that card this turn. Even without the attack trigger, this is a nice card. Giving up a couple cards you don't need to dig deeper into your deck while playing a 3-mana 3/3 with haste is pretty sweet. And once you have that threshold of 7 cards, you start to get a free card out of your graveyard. And sure, it's random, and the fact you get a card might mean you can't do it again because you exiled the card and maybe you have fewer than 7 now, but even just getting 1 card out of that attack trigger, almost no matter what it is going to feel really good. It's less likely you're able to play that card the turn you play Tursa, just because you'll have already spent 3 mana, and you do have to spend mana on it, but it still looks like a powerful card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Twin Bolt, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets. This was an original Tarkir, and it was pretty good. It really punishes X1s. Like, if you can take down 2 2-mana creatures with 1 toughness with this, it's kind of backbreaking. And it still has the upside of being able to kill an X2 or kill an X1 and do 1 to the opponent, or kill a couple of 1/1s, and so on. The ability to divide the damage is surprisingly good. I don't think it's quite enough for it to be premium, but it's not far off, and if it turns out you can wipe out 2 X1s with this with regularity, it'll definitely get better, but I'm starting it at a C+. Next up, it's Underfoot Underdogs, which for 2 generic and a red is a common Goblin Warrior. It's a 1/2. When it enters, you create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it, and target creature you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. A 3-mana 1/2 that makes a 1/1 is solid, and means this makes good sacrifice fodder, and it helps you go wide, things you want to be doing in red. Its activated ability, not the most impressive thing. I can't really think of a time where a card that had this ability actually felt good, but it's upside on what is already a decent card. You can potentially use it to keep a mobilized token alive, like if you want to do damage and sacrifice it in your second main phase or something. And sometimes you have a small creature that can do some work when it gets in, but it's a pretty mediocre ability overall that is not useful all that often. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Unsparing Boltcaster, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 ogre wizard at uncommon. When it enters, it deals 5 damage to target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. This type of card that only damages or kills something that's already been damaged in a turn usually doesn't play super well. It's just hard to set things up so that the turn you play it, something has also been damaged. And oftentimes, in order to set that up, you have to give up something significant to inflict that damage. But this is going to be better than in most sets thanks to Mobilize. Your opponent will often block one of those little tokens, and the Boltcaster can come down and finish off whatever they blocked with. And when you're giving up a token that is temporary anyway, you're not really giving up anything. And when you can set it up, like if this is a 3-mana 3/3 that enters and destroys target creature, obviously it's nuts. It does still take some setup. I just think it's approachable setup in a format like this one, so I think it's a C+. Next up, it's War Effort, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+0. Whenever you attack, create a 1/1 red warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. 4 mana for an enchantment that gives +1/+0 to your whole board is not really worth it. It definitely gets better the wider you can go, and it gets better the more Mobilize you have. But there are still lots of situations where you'd rather have, like, Summit Intimidator, a creature that adds to the board and has an effect, than you would a card that just buffs a couple of creatures. Basically, this doesn't do that much on its own, and I think that's a problem. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Wild Ride, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains haste until end of turn, and it has Harmonize for 4 generic and a red. I'm not really into this. Using up a card for +3/+0 and haste is not a great plan, especially when it's a sorcery, so you can never use it as a combat trick. And even though it harmonizes, you won't usually feel like you've gotten a full card out of it, even when you cast it twice. It can sort of help with Flurry, since the buff on the first creature can help you pay for Harmonize, which is kind of funny, but I don't think that's enough. The haste part comes up sometimes, but you'd be surprised how infrequently being able to give a creature haste and +3/+0 so that it can attack right away is actually relevant. Like, not buffing a creature's toughness means that mini creatures are really not that much better at attacking than they were before the buff, for example. So, not impressed with this that much overall. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Zurgo's Vanguard, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon dog soldier. It's a *3 with Mobilize 1, and its power is equal to the number of creatures you control. So even if your board's empty, it's a 1/3, and when it attacks, it'll become a 2/3 at minimum, and its power will often be higher. If you have multiple mobilized creatures swinging in, this thing can hit really hard, but it still only has 3 toughness, so it isn't like it's ever going to be an amazing attacker for the mana. I think it's just a C. Alright, so those are all the red cards in Tarkir Dragonstorm. In the next video, we'll look at all the green ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out there, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.